If you have been looking for FSSC 22000 course to pass the audit and obtain the certification, this is your course, because we will give you all the documents and records you need and the hints and the practices to pass the audit stage 1 and stage 2 and be certified. And we are going to use examples from New Zealand specifically because New Zealand is known for excelling in all these practices in operational excellence of all the standards mentioned here. And then you can tailor it to your local regulations and legislations. All right. So whether you are an auditor looking for which documents to look for to carry your internal or external audits, or if you are a leader or a technician or an inspector, this course is going to give you the implementation roadmap that you can use to improve and get certified. And this is specific for cold storage, warehousing, and logistics. If you want for manufacturing and other parts, you can check our YouTube channel at QHSC 360 Global on YouTube. Now, let's address first what FSSC adds for logistics. FSSC 22000 strengthens ISO 22000 with additional requirements, specifically targeting vulnerabilities in storage and transport operations crucial for the food supply chain. Many logistics organizations successfully operating under ISO 22000 often encounter challenges or non-conformities during FSSC 22000 certifications due to these enhanced requirements, which we are going to show you so you will not have any challenge anymore. And that is reflecting the rigorous standards upheld by global certification bodies. The example we are giving you from New Zealand, many logistics organizations operating under ISO 22000 find the FSSC 22000 certification more challenging due to these additional requirements, which align with the rigorous standards of bodies like the Ministry of Primary Industry, MPI. To look at the critical additional areas for operations, these requirements address common gaps often identified within cold storage and logistics sectors globally. All right? So they represent frequent resources of non-conformities during FSSC audits conducted by certification bodies. And organizations must comply with local food safety regulations, very importantly. So pay attention to local regulations. For instance, in New Zealand, these requirements are aligned with broader regulatory expectations under the Food Act of 2014 and are enforced by New Zealand recognized certification bodies. Now, those additional requirements, first from the transport and storage control specifications, including adherence to local food safety programs. Example here, in New Zealand, these include adherence to MPI food safety programs. Secondly, you have food defense and security measures relevant to the specific supply chain context. An example for food defense and security measures in New Zealand, these measures are relevant to New Zealand's unique supply chain. And thirdly, so actually you can tailor that to your also regulations. Thirdly, the food fraud vulnerability assessment are tailored to market risks. So example, in New Zealand here, we have assessment tailored to New Zealand market risk, and also you can have assessment tailored to your legislations and statutory risks. Given the principles that we are going to share, the principles are the same. Everything is the same. We are just using an example so that you can replicate on similarities in your own country. And third additional requirement is the management of subcontracted services. ensuring compliance with relevant legislations and standards also. An example here, we will have ensuring compliance with New Zealand legislations and standards. The fifth additional requirements is label integrity and logo use requirements, reflecting consumer protection laws. An example here, we will have in New Zealand reflecting New Zealand consumer protection laws. So I want you to replicate all that to your own regulatory requirements. Now let's look at the Universal Transport and Storage Controls for FSSC. FSSC transport requirements extend beyond basic temperature monitoring to encompass vehicle hygiene, loading discipline, and segregation during transport. So if you remember in part 3, we mentioned the hygiene and the temperature, but here those are a specific additional requirement, and segregation also during the transport. And these requirements align with relevant food safety program guidelines. And in our example here in New Zealand, this includes the MPI food safety programs. And these controls are crucial and must function effectively whether transport is owned by the organization or subcontracted. All right? Now, when you talk about the vehicle hygiene, the additional requirement here for FSSC, the pre-loading inspection protocols is required, and cleaning verifications and sanitation standards for refrigerated vehicles. This ensuring compliance with national or regional food safety standards. You can apply it whether it's for New Zealand or you apply it for in Africa or Middle East or America or Europe. You must comply with national or regional food safety standards for vehicle hygiene, such as preloading inspection protocol, cleaning verification, and sanitation standards for refrigerated vehicles. Those are the requirements of FSSC. The other requirement regarding the temperature integrity, vehicle temperature validation, pre-cooling temperature, okay, and continuous monitoring during transport are critical for maintaining food safety and quality, often governed by national food legislations. So this is additional requirement by FSSC, and in example of in New Zealand, this is mandated by Food Act of 2014. Thirdly, we have loading discipline. This means loading sequences designed to prevent cross-contamination, proper stacking, and securing of loads in line with national safety guidelines for safety handling and relevant occupational health and safety legislations. For example, in New Zealand, this refers to WorkSafe New Zealand's guidelines and the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015. And then we have segregation standards, physical separation of allergen and incompatible products to be maintained throughout the transport, adhering to national and international food safety regulations for preventing cross-contaminations. Now, those are in FSSC is where you will find food defense and food fraud. You will not find them in ISO 22000. And here, food defense address deliberate contamination threats. That's food defense, okay? While food fraud focuses on economically motivated adulteration. That's the difference. The food defense addresses the deliberate contamination threats by internal or external parties. And food fraud focus on economically motivated adulteration. such as from suppliers or from other third parties. Both require robust vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability assessment is specific to cold chain and logistic operations, ensuring compliance with relevant legislations and regulatory body expectations. For instance, again in New Zealand, this includes adherence to local regulations. As when we are recording this in February 2026, so you might be watching in the future and you need to check for the latest updates. The food defense elements include site security and access control. That's the first elements in food defense. Site security and access control, for example, align with WorkSafe New Zealand guidelines and the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015 in New Zealand. Second element is vehicle security and tamper evidence seal. For example, this is crucial for inter-island transport in New Zealand or in case of transportation. Thirdly, you have visitor management and ID verification is a third element in food defense. For example, consistent with New Zealand privacy principles. And the fourth element is CCTV coverage of critical areas. For example, in New Zealand, cold storage and distribution centers to be covered by the CCTV. The fifth element of food defense is step background scanning. For example, adhering to New Zealand employment law and best practices for high security roles. And six, you have vulnerability assessment for high risk products. For example, informed by MPI food defense guidelines in New Zealand. And then you have food fraud consideration is the elements for food fraud considerations. First, you have product substitution risk assessment. For example, with focus on product supplied to New Zealand retail chains like Foodstuff and Woolworth. The second element is supplier verification procedures. For example, including checks for MPI certification and compliance in New Zealand. So you can reflect all these things to your local jurisdictions, all right? All the elements. I'm giving example for within New Zealand, and you need to replicate that to your own jurisdiction and legislations and regulatory requirements. The third element is authenticity verification where applicable. For example, especially for imported goods and New Zealand origin claims under the Food Act of 2014. The fourth element, you have chain of custody documentation. For example, meticulously maintained for New Zealand cold chain traceability. And the fifth element for food fraud is awareness training for receiving staff. For example, on identifying potential fraud indicators as per MPI food safety programs requirements in New Zealand. Those are the elements of food defense and food fraud. Now let's look at the FSSC subcontracted transport and services. When transports or other food safety critical services are subcontracted for the FSSC, based on FSSC requirements, your organization remains accountable for food safety outcomes. Complying with relevant food safety legislations, for example, in New Zealand, these include compliance with regulations like the Food Act of 2014 and Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015. FSSC requires robust system for selecting, approving, and monitoring subcontractors to ensure compliance with regulatory expectations and international standards. So for instance, again in New Zealand, this aligned with MPI Ministry for Primary Industry expectations. First, for the subcontractor and transport services, you need approval process. And this means a documented criteria for subcontractor selections, including comprehensive food safety capability assessments, aligning with global food safety standards and relevant regulations. For example, in New Zealand, this includes alignment with MPI food safety programs. Secondly, you need clear responsibilities for subcontracted transports and services. You need written agreements specifying food safety requirements, such as temperature standards for cold chain logistics. For example, typically between 0 and 4 degrees Celsius for chilled and below minus 18 degrees Celsius for frozen, and hygiene expectations and compliance with food safety legislations. Thirdly, you need ongoing monitoring, performance evaluations for subcontractors and transport services, and continuous temperature data review and periodic audit or inspections conducted in line with best practices for certifications bodies to ensure sustained compliance. Fourthly, for subcontracted transport and services, you need evidence of oversight. You need a robust records demonstrating active management of subcontractors' food safety performance, providing assurance to regulatory bodies. For FSSC, labeling, handling, and logo use in logistics, FSSC requires robust controls to maintain label integrity throughout handling within cold storage and logistics operations, and for the proper use of the certification marks. Okay? Damage or incorrect labels can lead to significant customer complaints or regulatory breaches. So organizations must comply with local food safety regulations. For label handling, and first, when we talk about the label integrity during the handling, for FSSC, it requires that you must have procedures, and your procedures must be in place to prevent label damage during storage, picking, and loading operations. That's the requirement of FSSC for labeling. And these include a specific training for material handling equipment operators on careful handling. And for the claim control, FSSC here require you having verification processes that are essential for products making specific claims, for example, organic or halal or allergic free, and this must ensure handling according to requirements and maintaining strict segregations to prevent cross-contamination and compliance with relevant national labeling and verification standards. And for certification mark usage, FSSC 22000 requiring you the correct use of the FSSC 22000 logo on website, documentation, and communication for operations is critical. And this requires a strict compliance with FSSC logo usage guidelines and scheme requirements, as well as adherence to any specific national regulations regarding certification marks. Now, let's look at the FSSC 22000 additional requirement checklist for global context, and this is the complete checklist that if you meet the requirements, you will get certified. First, the requirement in number 2.1, constructions and layout of building. The documentation required here is the maintenance records in line with local food safety regulations, and you need to retain them for 3 years. And here, the evidence you need to submit to the auditor to meet class 2.1 of FSSC 22000, you need your buildings must be suitable for food operations with adequate separation of areas and designed to prevent contamination and providing adequate space for operations. For example, sufficient pallet storage and maneuvering space for forklift in a logistics warehouse. All right? For example, in New Zealand, this applies to cold storage facilities in locations such as Auckland or Christchurch, adhering to MPI guideline. Then in class 2.2, the requirements here is a layout of premises and workplace. Required documentation here. Okay, required documentation here is a layout reviews addressing local occupational health and safety legislations, and the retention period should be for 3 years for this documentation. The evidence you should, the auditor should see in your documentation is a logical flow preventing cross-contamination. For example, separate zones for chilled versus frozen products, and adequate space for equipment and material, and segregation of raw from finished products, if applicable in your operations. And also you must follow local operational standards. And then in class 2.3, the requirement for utilities and air and water and energy, utilities, air, water, and energy. The requirements here, the documentation you should have is for water testing results against applicable drinking water standards, and retain those results for 3 years. For example, in New Zealand, these include compliance with New Zealand drinking water standards. And the auditor will look for evidence that your results are for potable water supply and water quality is monitored as per relevant standards, and adequate lighting also, for example, for picking operations, and ventilation is appropriate for storage conditions, for example, preventing condensations in chillers. And to give you example in New Zealand context, this should be in adherence to New Zealand drinking water standards for water quality. And then in class 2.4 for waste disposal, the requirements here is the waste disposal records to be kept as per the local environmental regulations and council bylaws, and retain those records for the minimum of 3 years. Example, in New Zealand, this includes the HSNO Act of 1996. So, the evidence that you need to submit to the editor here, the auditor here, is to verify that the waste containers are identified and regularly emptied, and waste is removed by licensed contractors, and waste transfer note remain for audit by local authorities also. Example, in New Zealand, the waste is removed by licensed New Zealand contractors and audited by MPI or local councils. And then in class 2.5, for equipment suitability, cleaning, and maintenance, the records you need to keep here, including maintenance and cleaning records according to applicable food safety standards, and retain them for the lifetime of the equipment. Example, in New Zealand, this follows MPI standards. And the evidence for the auditor here, you must prove that your equipment are suitable for food contacts, if this is applicable, like if you have conveyors in packing area, so it must be food contact suitable, and you must maintain that to prevent contamination, and cleaning procedures must be documented and followed using approved sanitizers by MPI, and records are maintained. And for example, in New Zealand, again, you need to use MPI approved sanitizer. And for class 2.6 is the requirements of management review of purchase materials. And here the document requires you need supplier evaluations and purchase specifications aligned with local food safety requirements, and you retain those records for 3 years, An example in New Zealand, these must be aligned with MPI requirements. Your evidence must confirm that suppliers are approved based on food safety risk assessments, and the specifications are defined, and incoming inspections are performed, and certificates of conformance are obtained also. For example, imported ingredient or packaging. And in New Zealand, for example, supplier must be approved based on New Zealand food safety risk assessments. Then in class 2.7, it requires measurements for prevention of cross-contamination. And here you need to keep the records of monitoring records. You need to retain them in line with local food safety programs and retain them for the minimum of 3 years. In New Zealand, this you must do it in compliance with MPI food safety programs. And your evidence must confirm that physical separation or procedural controls, for example, dedicated handling equipments for allergens, are controlled, and also you have controlled traffic flows, for example, separate pathways for raw and ready-to-eat products in a processing plant. And also you have equipment dedicated or cleaned between usage, and allergen controls if this is applicable as per local guidelines. And then in class 2.8, the requirement is for cleaning and sanitizing. This is mandatory requirement here. The cleaning and sanitizing is mandatory. And cleaning records must be compliant with food safety legislations and retained for 3 years. And the evidence you need to submit here, the cleaning schedules for all the areas and equipments, and cleaning agents must be approved for food use, and effectiveness must be verified. For example, swapping results must be checked by an accredited lab, and records must be maintained. And then in 2.9, you have pest control. Here you need to keep records of pest control reports from registered providers and retain them for 3 years. And the evidence you need to submit, those control must confirm that pest control programs by the company are conducted by the competent contractor. So your pest control must be registered and competent, and bed stations are mapped and monitored, and pest sites are recorded and investigated, and corrective actions are taken as per the regulatory expectations. And then in class 2.10, you have personal hygiene and employee facilities. Personal hygiene and employee facilities here is a mandatory requirement in FSSC 22000. The records you need to keep here are of hygiene training records conforming to local occupational health, occupational safety standards, and you keep those records for the duration of the employee plus 7 years after the employment. And those records must confirm as approved to the auditor that hygiene requirements are defined and communicated, and hand washing facilities are adequate and well maintained, and toilets do not open directly to food area, and changing facilities are provided, and workers follow hygiene practices. For example, wearing PPEs. And then you have class 2.11 is for the rework. And the requirements here, you need records for the reworks compliant with relevant Food Safety Act, and you retain them for 3 years. And this actually rework might not be applicable for the cold storage for the most part. All right. But if it's applicable, rework must be identified and stored separately, and food safety maintained, and traceability must be ensured. Now, in class 2.12, it requires the product recall and procedure, and this is a mandatory requirement. So you must conduct mock recalls and keep the records aligning with the local recall guidelines and retain them for 3 years. And this is mandatory. And the auditor will need evidence that record procedures are documented and responsibilities are assigned and customer contracts are detailed correctly and mock recalls are conducted annually and effectiveness is verified. And if you see also most of the requirements here, you might, like for example, the recall, those requirements, you might have implemented them if you have ISO 22000 already, right? Now, for the warehousing is mandatory requirement here, class 2.13 is mandatory requirement for temperature records and stock rotations record as per industry best practices. This is mandatory, and you must retain these documents for 3 years. The auditor will need evidence that temperature is controlled, temperature control storage, like for example, minus 18 degrees Celsius for frozen goods, and continuous monitoring is implemented, and FIFO, or first in, first out, has been practiced, for example, for perishable goods, and stock rotations are verified, and segregation of non-conforming products and protection from contaminations also is implemented. And then you have clause 2.14 for product information and customer awareness. Here you need to keep records of the label verifications, compliance with the local food standards codes, and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will need evidence that labels are maintained during handling and damaged labels are reported and customer informations are accurate and compliance with local labeling regulations. And then in class 2.15 for food defense and biovigilance and bioterrorism, this is mandatory requirements, and it requires you to have food defense assessment as per the local guidelines and retain the record for 3 years. And this is a mandatory requirements. Auditor will need evidence that vulnerability assessment have been conducted and access control have been implemented. For example, visitors log or restricted areas or key controls and temperature and temper prevention measures have been implemented, and incident response plan is in place. And then in FSSC, additional requirements for 2.5.1 for allergen management. All right. It requires allergen assessment to have documents that are aligned with local food standards code and retain them for 3 years. And here, okay, the auditors want to see evidence that allergens are identified in product handled, for example, dairy or gluten in multi-product cold storage, and cross contacts are prevented, and cleaning is validated, and labeling are accurate. And you can find in our HACCP implementation more details if you want to do this there. For example, mandatory allergen declarations and staff trained on allergen management principles. And then you have FSSC additional requirement 2.5.2 for food fraud mitigations. This is mandatory requirements. You must have documents for vulnerability assessment as per the local food fraud guidance and retain them for 3 years, and this is mandatory. And the auditors will need evidence that vulnerability assessments for products handled, for example, economically motivated adulterations, risks relevant to supply chains, are being assessed against and handled, and mitigation measures are implemented for supplier verifications and testing if appropriate, and reviewed annually in response to market intelligence. And then in FSSC additional requirements, clause 2.5.3 for logo use, here the local use, you need document for local use approval from FSSC 22000, and you keep it for the duration of the use. And the evidence you need here, you need FSSC logo used only when certified, so the auditor need evidence for that, and used correctly per FSSC requirements, and removed if certification is suspended or withdrawn. And then in FSSC additional requirements 2.5.4 for allergen management. This is the expansion. Here, the allergen controls are aligned with best practices. You need documents for that. And you need to confirm to show evidence that if handling allergen containing products, the allergen register and risk assessment and controls with segregation, cleaning, labeling as per the local food standards, and verification and staff are trained. And then for FSSC, additional requirement 2.5.5 for environmental monitoring, it requires you to have documents for environmental monitoring results for local contexts, and you need to retain those records for 3 years. And the auditor will need evidence that for high risk products, for example, the environmental monitoring programs like surfaces and air and water sampling plan is implemented, and corrective actions for positive results are also being handled. And then in FSSC additional requirements, class 5.2.5.6 for product formulation, it requires you to have document for specifications and retain them for the production lifetime. And this usually is not applicable because you are not producing the product. But if it's applicable, no, it's not applicable. Now for FSSC additional requirement number 2.5.7 for preventive provenance, country of origins, and chain of custody, it requires you to have documents of chain of custody records for the supply chain and retain them for 3 years. The auditors will need evidence of country of origin being maintained through the storage and chain of custody being documented and customer requirements for origin being met. And in FSSC additional requirement number 2.5.8 for services, it requires you to have records for service records for providers and retain them for 3 years. The auditors will need evidence of services, for example, transport and storage being controlled to maintain food safety and temperature being maintained and hygiene being maintained also, and traceability also being maintained throughout the logistics network. And then in FSSC additional requirement number 2.5.9 for labeling, it requires you to have documents for label control records compliant with local food standards code and retain them for 3 years. The auditor will look for evidence that labels are protected during handling and label damage are prevented and labeling are controlled if applicable with documented procedures, and labels are accurate, label accuracy are verified against regulatory requirements. And then you have FSSC additional requirements number 2.5.10 for food defense expansion. The food defense records are needed here as per the local guidelines and retain them for 3 years. And you need to provide the proof to the auditor evidence for the threat assessment and access control for visitors management, the sign-in and key control like CCTV if appropriate, and tamper evidence packaging and incident response and staff awareness training as advised by the local authorities. And then in FSSC additional requirements, number 2.5.11 for mitigating fraud, you need to have documents for fraud mitigation records aligning with local intelligence, and you need to retain that for 3 years. And here, you need evidence for vulnerability assessment updated annually, and suppliers verification and testing program if appropriate, especially for high value imported goods, and industry intelligence monitoring. And then in FSSC additional requirements number 2.5.11 for subcontracted transports and storage. This is a mandatory requirement, so you need some contractors, you need documents for subcontractors evaluation, and transport records as required by local authorities and retain them for 3 years, and this is mandatory also. And the auditors will look for evidence of transport providers being approved and food safety requirements being specified in contracts, and temperature control being verified, and hygiene verifications and performance monitoring and audit being conducted. And then in FSSC, additional requirement number 2.5.13 for warehousing and distribution expanded this point. You need records for warehouse monitoring records for facilities and retain them for 3 years. And you need to show the auditor and evidence that temperature monitoring is continuous in large controls. For example, alarm is functional and the stock rotations is verified and segregation are maintained. For example, non-food items being separated, and loading and unloading are controlled, and vehicle hygienes are verified. All right, so those are the additional requirements. Now let's look at the stage 1. What does stage 1 really decide for operations here? Stage 1 is not a mere paperwork formality in FSSC 22000. It is a critical decision point for organizations seeking FSSC 22000 certification. Auditors, often operating under recognized accreditation bodies, assess the completeness of your food safety management system. All right. So they don't assess only documents. It's not like ISO here. They assess the complete FSMS. The accuracy of your defined scope also is being assessed for cold storage and logistics operations, and your overall operational readiness. And this ensures alignment with both the FSSC 22000 standards and relevant local legislations. For instance, in New Zealand, these include legislation such as Food Act 2014 and Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015. Furthermore, auditors might consider the scope for cold storage and logistics across specific regions like North and South Island. We have 3 core questions for certification readiness here in scope 1, in stage 1. In the scope, is this the questions for stage 1: is the scope correct and aligned with local food safety authority requirements? And is the FSMS ready for the audit? And is FSSC certifications viable for your operations? Those are the core questions for certification readiness. An example in New Zealand, alignment with Ministry for Primary Industries and requirement is crucial, and the viability for the New Zealand operations is assessed in this case. So stage 1 outcome for business, to proceed to stage 2, your system is deemed largely, if they say that, then it's likely ready for a full on-site audit with only minor gaps that can be addressed. And if deferred, that means significant gaps are identified and requiring isolation and evidence of corrective actions before a stage 2 audit can be scheduled. And this might relate to non-compliance with local occupational health and safety or environmental protection guidelines. Those will mainly be the outcome of stage 1. An example here in New Zealand, this could relate to non-compliance with WorkSafe New Zealand or EPA guidelines. So the scope revision here, the documented scope of your organization's operations does not accurately reflect reality and necessitating a clear redefinition before proceeding. So they will recommend your scope revision in that case. Now, to look at common stage 1 failure for FSSC 22000, understanding why organizations fail in stage 1 help prevent deferral and costly delay. And these patterns appear consistently across cold chain certifications attempt globally. First, you have a common failure is having incorrect scope. We talk about this in part 1, and we have drafted ideal scope there. A scope exclude activities actually controlled by the organizations or include activities not under their direct operational control, that will lead to failure. So if you need to draft proper scope, visit part 1, but this will lead to failure in all the standards. If your scope exclude activities that you do and include activities that you don't do. Second one is transport exclusion error. You need to include the transport. If you exclude the transport, then also you will fail stage 1. And then when you have weak PPE, your PPE also must be adapted. So, and also insufficient risk assessment also will lead to stage 1 failure. All right. Now, how to pass stage 1 the first time? Let's look at that. Achieving stage 1 success requires management to clearly explain operations. Number 1, your management must clearly be able to understand and explain the operations. All right? So firstly, your management must be able to clearly explain operations, demonstrate understanding of risks, and show logical control design, and all within relevant regulatory frameworks. So preparations focuses on clarity and completeness and not perfection. All right? Now, if you want to pass stage 1, the first time, you need to brief your management, or they should be able to demonstrate, to explain the operations, just to understand, to have understanding. Explaining clearly means to articulate exactly your organization does and what your organizations don't do, and what you control and what your responsibility, where your responsibilities as an organization begins and end. All right? And especially considering the unique aspects of cold chain logistics. So your management should be able to articulate that. For instance, in New Zealand, this involves detailing the specific logistics relevant to its geographical and regulatory landscape. And this, in essence, is easy for management to do. Secondly, prepare also your management to understand your specific risk. You should be able to demonstrate genuine understanding of food safety and quality, and health and safety, and environmental risk specific to your operations. And these include compliance with local food safety regulations, occupational health and safety standards, and environmental protection laws. So for instance, in New Zealand, this encompasses the MPI Act, Food Act 2014, WorkSafe New Zealand Guidelines, the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015, EPA regulations, the Resources Management Act of 1991, and the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act of 1996. So you should be able to understand the specific risks related to the regulatory guidelines. And then also you must show control logics to explain why specific controls were chosen and how they functions and how effectiveness is verified in the context of relevant national or international standards and audit practices. For example, in New Zealand, this would reference WorkSafe approved codes of practice where applicable, aligning with local audit practices. So always incorporate your local regulations. And thirdly, to prepare and pass the stage 1 audit, you need to provide honest scope, to define a scope accurately to reflect actual operations and include regional variations and seasonal fluctuations and peak period activities relevant to local market demands. All right. I hope those tips is just like 4 tips. If you note them down and prepare your management and prepare a couple of slides to go through it and tailor it to your specific organizations and legislations and the local requirements, you should be able to pass stage 1. But confirm, or first take note and make sure you align with these points before you invite for stage 1 or before you schedule stage 1. Now we will take a look at integrated stage 1 audit checklist, and this is for all the standards. All right, this for all the standards that we covered, including ISO 9001, ISO 45001, ISO 14001, and ISO 22000. All right, if we look at class 1 to class 4.1 to class 4.3, the document requirements here in all the standards, you need context of analysis with the specific standard like QMS or OH&S and EMS and FSMS, and integrated parties registers and scope statements, all mandatory. So you need to integrate all of them when you are implementing. Here, just to explain for the uninitiated, integrated means if you are implementing all the standards, instead of implementing them all one by one, you can use this checklist and get certified in all of them at once. And those documentation hierarchy and highlights, it shows where you need to integrate some documents, and some documents you leave them specific. So if you conduct context analysis, it must cover all the standards, and the interested parties register must cover all the standards, and the scope statement is also mandatory and must cover all the standards. And for the audit check, what the auditors will check here, the auditor will review scope accuracy and context understanding and interested parties identification for relevance to cold storage. All right. Here, for example, and you can replicate this example in your own jurisdictions. For example, here, for the context analysis and interested parties and scope statement, auditors will check relevance to New Zealand cold storage conditions, including specific interested parties like food staff or Woolworth, New Zealand. The key deliverables to cover from class 4.1 to class 4.3, you need to have current scope statements for each standards. You need to have context analysis completed within 12 months. You need to have interested parties being identified with expectations being documented also. So you have 3 deliverables here. All right. Class 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. Scope statement for each standard, context analysis completed within 12 months, and interested parties with expectations being documented. And then in class 4.4, for ISO 9001, ISO 45001, ISO 14001, and ISO 22001 clauses, 4.4, you need process maps. Process maps for QMS, for OH&S, for EMS, and for FSMS showing interactions. All right? The auditors here will confirm the processes are identified and interactions understood with the operational environment. And the deliverable for you here, you need integrated process map showing how quality, safety, environmental, and food safety processes interact for cold storage logistics. All right? Now, that's for class 4. So for integrated management, you need to have 4 deliverables, okay? And then for the leadership, class 5, for all the standards, class 5.1 to 5.3, for ISO 9001, ISO 45001, ISO 14001, and ISO 22000. First, you need policies for quality, HSC, environmental, occupational health and safety. You need policies to cover quality, OH&S, occupational health and safety, and environmental, and food safety, and all are mandatory requirements. Okay? And you need also to have responsibility metrics for all the standards. Auditors here will review policies for completeness. They will review organizational structure and to ensure alignment with regulatory expectations. The deliverables you need here, you need all 4 policies being approved by the top management and dated within the certification period. And second deliverable, you need responsibilities being assigned to named individuals with evidence of communications also. And then in class 5.4, for ISO 45001, separately, you need consultation procedure, you need health and safety committee charter, and you need meeting minutes. All right? This is separate additional for the safety. Here, the auditors will confirm workers' consultation mechanisms is established as per the relevant health and safety legislation. And here, the deliverable you need to show the auditors, first you need health and safety committee being established. You need representatives being elected as per the national guidelines. So you need that documents to prove these points. Now let's look at class 6. That's class 5. Now let's look at class 6 for all the standards, including ISO 9001, ISO 45001, ISO 14001, and ISO 22000. In class 6.1, the requirement here, you need to have risk registers for QMS, for OH&S, for EMS, and for FSMS. And here, the auditors will review risk identification methodology and completeness of cold storage operations. Okay? Here, you need to prepare the risks being identified for each standard and opportunities being identified and risk assessment methodology being documented. Then you have separate requirement here also for class 6.1.2 for ISO 45001. You need hazard identification procedure, and this is mandatory. And you need hazard register with risk assessment. So here, the auditor will review hazard identification process and completeness and ensure alignment with national guidelines. The deliverable for you here, you need all cold storage hazards being identified, for example, the forklift, the cold exposure or hot exposure, and manual handling, and slip, trips, and falls, and ammonia refrigerations, and working at height. And you need risk assessment being completed here, and controls being identified based on national health and safety principles. And then in class, and also you need a separate requirement for ISO 14001 class 6.1.4, you need environmental aspect procedure, and this is mandatory. The aspect procedure. And you need aspect register, and you need significance of aspects evaluation. The auditors will review aspects identification and significance determination relevant to national environmental regulations. And then the deliverables you need to have for class 6.1.2, you need all activities being assessed for aspects. You need to provide evidence for that, for example, including electricity, refrigerants, water consumptions, waste generations, emissions, and fuel, for example. And then you need to provide evidence also, or you need to prepare your documentation for significance criteria being defined and significant aspects being identified and life cycle perspective being documented, and considering national environmental acts also. So you have two deliverables to document and give evidence for here. And for clause 6.1.3, here you have for ISO 9001, ISO 45001, and ISO 14001, you need legal register that combining all three together, and this is mandatory. And auditors will review legal identification process and completeness and ensure all relevant national legislations is captured. The deliverables you need here, you need all applicable national laws being identified, and you need to show compliance with the status tracked and permits or consents from national environmental protection agencies, for example, and local council being identified. And then you have separately for, we are coming now for clause 8, we have for ISO 22000, clause 8.2, it's mandatory here to have PRP procedures. And here the auditors will review PRP identification and documentation and confirm that they are aligned with National Food Safety Authority requirements. So here your deliverable, you must have PRP documented for infrastructure, cleaning, pest control, hygiene, temperature control, water, waste, suppliers, traceability, and allergen if applicable, and all relevant national food safety standards for all this. And then in class ISO 22000 class 8.4 to 8.5, it will require you to have hazard plan, and this is mandatory requirement, and have hazard analysis, and also mandatory requirement, and have product descriptions, and have flow diagram. And auditors will review HACCP system completeness and logic and ensure compliance with National Food Safety Act and programs. And here you need to have deliverables, two deliverables. First, you need to have HACCP team competence and product are described and flow diagrams are verified. And then you need to have hazards being identified for each step, CCP being identified if any, and control measures being defined, and you need also validation evidence. And then we come back to clause 6.2 for all the standards, 9001, 14001, 45,001, and 22,000. Clause 6.2 requires objectives and is mandatory for all the standards here: quality, OH&S, environmental, and food safety. It's mandatory to have all the objectives. Here the auditors will review objectives for a SMART criteria and linkage to significant aspects or risk within the operational control. And here you need to have two deliverables. The first deliverable, you need to have your objectives being documented, your objectives to be measurable and linked to policy and significant aspects or hazards or risks. And then you need to have the second deliverable if to have action plan being defined and responsibilities being assigned. And then you have FSSC additional requirements. We have Food defense plans is mandatory requirement. Food fraud vulnerability assessment is mandatory requirements. And subcontractor approval procedure is also mandatory requirement. And here the auditor will review food defense, food mitigations, fraud mitigations, and subcontractors controls and relevant national supply chains. And here you need to have you have to have the deliverables should include threat assessment being completed and vulnerability assessment for fraud also. For example, is specific to imported or exported goods. All right. And also you need to have transport providers being approved with agreement for logistics. Now, if we move here to Class 7 support for all the standards in ISO 9001, ISO 45001, ISO 14001, ISO 22000, Class 7.2, it requires competence metrics for all the standards. And this is mandatory. QMS, OHS, EMS, FSMS. Okay? It's mandatory. And here, you need, here, auditor will review competence requirements, definition, relevance to the national workforce and roles. And your deliverables include competence requirements defined for all the roles affecting quality, safety, environment, and food safety, and training needed to be identified also. And then in Class 7.5 also for all the standards, it requires document control procedure and record control procedure and document master list. This Class 7.5 for all the standards. And auditors will review document control system and confirming adherence to national data retention and privacy standards. And your deliverables here, you need to have documented information being controlled, including approval and version control and distributions. And you need to have retention period being defined and records being identified. And then in ISO 22000 Class 8.7, it requires calibration procedures and calibration schedule and equipment list. For ISO 22000 Class 8.7, and auditors will review calibration system, ensuring traceability to national or international standards. And here you need, in your deliverables, you need to deliver monitoring equipments being identified, for example, thermometer and data triggers for cold chains, and calibration frequency being defined, and traceability calibration sources also being defined. Then we move to operations for all the standards. We start with Class 8.1 for quality management system. It requires here operational control procedures, including receiving, storage, and dispatch in our context of cold chain storage and warehouses and logistics. So here, Class 8.1 for ISO 9001 requires operational control procedures. Procedure for receiving, procedure for storage, procedure for dispatch. Auditors will review operational controls for cold chain within logistics here. And your deliverables will include procedure being documented for receiving inspection, temperature monitoring, first in and first out or first in and first expiry procedure, and pre-dispatch checks and vehicle verification. And for ISO 45001, Class 8.1 to 8.2, you have here occupational health and safety operational control are required, and emergency response plan, which is mandatory. Auditors here will review hazard controls and emergency preparedness must be aligned with national health and safety expectations. And your deliverables here must include controls being documented for significant hazards, emergency procedures for ammonia, and leak or fire or earthquake or injury drill schedule must be defined, reflecting specific national risks. Then for ISO 14001 class 8.1 to 8.2, it requires environmental operational control and environmental emergency response plan, and this is mandatory as well. And here, auditors will review controls for significant aspects and emergency preparedness as per national environmental protection agencies and local control guidelines. And here your deliverables must include your controls being documented for significant aspects such as energy and waste and emission, and your emergency procedures for spill or leakage and drill must be scheduled and reflecting the national environmental context. And then in class 8.3 for ISO 22000, traceability procedure is mandatory requirements, and auditors will review traceability system design, ensuring compliance with National Food Safety Authority requirements. And here in your deliverable, you must have traceability system being documented, such as for incoming material with supplier and batch and date, and for storage like location and duration, and outgoing like customers and batch and date. So your sustainability system must be documented, and also your mock recall procedures must be defined, aligned with National Food Safety Recall Protocol also. And then in class 8.9 for ISO 22000, it requires non-conformance and corrective actions procedures, and this is mandatory requirements. The auditor will review non-conformance handling procedure. The auditors will review non-conformance handling process relevant to food safety incidents. And here your deliverable will be procedure for handling temperature excursions with quantities, assessments, dispositions, and customer notifications, and also investigation. And then for FSSC 22000 and ISO Technical Standards 22002.1, requirements here: cleaning procedure, which is mandatory, and pest control procedure, which is mandatory, and recall procedure, which is mandatory, and warehouse procedure, which is also mandatory. So you have cleaning procedure, pest control program, recall procedure, and warehouse procedure are mandatory. The auditor here will review prerequisite program documentation, ensuring alignment with national food safety specifications. And here your deliverables must include cleaning schedules and pest control contracts and reports, and also recall procedures with mock recall plan, and then for performance evaluation for all the standards, class 9.1 for ISO 9001 and 45001 and 14001 and 22001 and 22000, requirements here is monitoring plan to cover quality management system, occupational health and safety, environmental management system, and food safety management system. Auditor will review what will be monitored and how within a specific operational context. And your deliverable must include performance indicators defined for each standard, and monitoring methods defined, and analysis methods also being defined. And then in class 9.1.2 for ISO 45001 and ISO 14001, you have compliance evaluation procedure is mandatory requirement here, and the auditor will review compliance evaluation process, specifically checking against national legal and other requirements. So here your deliverables must include compliance evaluation frequency being defined and methodology being documented and responsibility being assigned. Then we have in class 9.2 for all the standards for ISO 9001, 45001, 14001, and 22000, it requires internal audit procedure, and this is mandatory for all the standards, an audit program, and a schedule. Here, the auditor will review audit program completeness, ensure all aspects relevant to national standards are covered. Your deliverables here will include your audit programs must cover all the requirements of all the standards annually. And auditors must be competent with the requirements defined. For example, awareness of national guidelines. And then in class 9.3, applicable for all the standards, like 9001, 45001, 14001, and 22000, it requires management review procedure, all mandatory for all the standards, and management review schedule. And here, auditors will review management review process, including outputs relevant to operations. Your deliverables here, your management review frequency must be defined, minimum should be conducted annually, and required inputs must be defined for each standard, and review must be scheduled. Then if we come to improvement in class 10.2 for all the standards, 9001, ISO 9001, ISO 45001, 14001, and 22000, it requires corrective action procedure and is mandatory for all the standards. And the auditors here will review corrective actions process, ensure effectiveness in operational contexts. And your deliverable, your corrective actions process must be documented with identifications and root cause analysis and actions and verifications and system updates. Now, let's look at the stage 1, key points readiness here. Okay. First, all statements must be approved and current. All policies must be approved by the top management. All mandatory procedures must be documented. All legal registers must be current and completed. All right. An example here we have in New Zealand, the current and complete legal registers. For example, HSWA 2015, RMA 1991, Food Act 2014, and HSNO Act. And hazard register must be complete with ISO 45001 and aligned with National Health and Safety Authority. And environmental aspects register must be complete with significance evaluation for ISO 14001 and aligned with national environmental protection agencies and local council rules. And HACCP plans must be complete with hazard analysis for ISO 22000, compliance with national food safety programs. And food defense and food fraud assessments must be complete for FSSC 22000, relevant to the supply chain. And all objectives must be set and measurable, and internal audits program must have been established, and management review must be scheduled, and competence requirements must be defined, and calibration system must be established for the ISO 22000 requirements, and traceability system must be documented for ISO 22000, and no major gap documentations. So those are the key highlights for all the standards. All right, the key readiness point. You can rewind, pause, and take notes. And for auditors from an accredited certification body, I'm stressing this point because some auditors that are non-accredited will tell you, I will help you. They will draft the documents. They will give you the certifications. Those are invalid certification. It can ruin you. And we'll leave that discussion for another day. But now let me focus on auditors from an accredited certification body will confirm overall system readiness for stage 2, specifically in the cold storage and logistics sector. And your deliverables here, you must demonstrate documentation and initial implementation for all listed items, providing evidence for operations. All right. Now let's take a look at the stage 2 for the cold storage logistics. For cold storage and logistics operations globally, stage 2 audits critically assess the implementation of food safety programs, compliance with occupational health and safety regulations, and adherence to environmental regulations. Auditors typically follow products through operations, observing real practices, verifying controls, and comparing documented procedures against on-the-ground reality. So expect auditors to spend significant time on the floor, especially during peak activities period, to ensure robust cold chain management and operational integrity. And some auditors will come at night, by the way. All right? For example, in New Zealand context, these include assessment against the Food Act of 2014 and Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015 and environmental regulations overseen by the EPA, and auditors are typically from New Zealand certification bodies. The key steps: first, the DAC observations, and then they will go to cold storage verifications. Then they will go to dispatch check, and then they will go to typical inspection. This is a detailed audit process here. The DAC observation first, they will observe the loading and unloading during the peak shifts, noting cold chain integrity at transfer point. For the cold storage verification, they will confirm the temperature ranges and stock rotation, for example, FIFO, in line with the food safety standards. And for the dispatch check, they will validate orders against customer requirements. They will verify accurate shipping labels and conduct temperature check for outbound goods. For vehicle inspection, they will inspect transport readiness and secure seals and verify continuous temperature logging for compliance with road transport regulations. For record review, they will examine documentation including temperature log, ESP records, and training and maintenance schedule for regulatory compliance. And then for the staff interview, they will conduct interview with key personnel on their understanding and applicable of FSP, health and safety, and operational procedures. All right. So stage 2 audit are designed to ensure your organization's cold chain management systems are effectively and compliant with local legislation. They involve detailed scrutiny of critical control points, verifying that all processes from DAC observations to dispatch checks maintain product integrity. Auditors will verify that staff are adequately trained and following approved code of practices, and that your environmental practices aligned with regulatory guidelines. Evidence of robust temperature monitoring, for example, using data loggers for temperature control vehicles, and adherence to food safety programs requirements are also paramount here. All right, let's look at integrated checklist for stage 2 audit for all the standards. All right, you have opening meeting. Just give me a second. Integrated stage 2 audit checklist, all standards. In opening meeting, the area is what auditors here will verify is the scope confirmations and audit plan review and logistics arrangement. The evidence required here, you need scope statements and audit plans and previous audit reports. The common finding here is management attendance and facility tour management and staff availability being confirmed. That's for the opening meeting. And document review, if any, they will review the documents, any outstanding documentations from stage 1, they will try to review here, and then update procedures. For example, they need, that could be like part of the evidence, like update procedures and new documents since stage 1. The common finding here, you have document control system functions. And then for the management system implementation. All right. Now for contracts, for context and scope, for all standards, what the auditors will verify here, they will verify context understanding influences decision. Scope accuracy reflects operations also. The evidence requires here the management review minutes showing context being discussed and scope review. Common findings here could include management can explain how external issues, for example, like customer requirements, relevant national or local regulations, affect the organization's operations. A scope matches actual activities observed. For example, in New Zealand, these include understanding how New Zealand regulations impact operations. Then you have leadership for all the standards. What the auditor will verify here, they will verify the management commitment visible, policies are communicated, and responsibilities also are understood. All right. The evidence requirement here, you need policy communication records and responsibility being assigned and leadership meeting minutes also. The common findings here is staff can explain policies and know their responsibilities, and management is visible on the floor and resources are provided. For the worker consultation specific to ISO 45001, the auditor here will verify workers genuinely are consolidated, are consulted, H&S committee are functional, and reports representatives are also empowered. And the evidence here will include H&S committee meeting minutes for the last 12 months and consultation records and worker representatives election records also. Common findings, the interview workers and representatives, they will do that and observe meeting effectiveness and verify consultation on change and hazard and investigation as per the local OH&S legislation. And then for the risk and opportunity management for all the standards, the auditor here will verify the risk are identified, are realistic and action taken and opportunities pursued. And The evidence you need here, you need risk registers with action and also risk records and actions completion evidence. Common finding here, when staff are aware of key risks and controls being implemented and functions and risk review influence the decision. And for hazard identification and risk assessment is specific to ISO 45001. Auditors here will look for all the hazards being that are identified and risk assessments are accurate and control are effectiveness. The evidence you need here, you need hazard register and risk assessment for all the activities and implementation records. Common findings, they will walk the warehouse, observations, they will look at the forklift operations like segregation and speed limits and pre-start checks in line with the national safety guides, and call exposure controls like with the rotation and warm-up breaks and PPE, and manual handling aids and slip preventions, floor conditions and footwear, and ammonia detection if applicable in line with chemical safety regulations, and working at height controls like racking access. And then for environmental aspects specific to ISO 14001, the auditor will look for all the aspects as evidence. They will look to verify all the aspects are identified and significance determination are logical and controls for the significant aspects are effective. And the evidence you could submit here, you need to submit aspect register, significant evaluation, and operational control and monitoring data. And then the common finding here, they will observe, the auditor will do their observations around the energy management, like lighting control and equipment shutdown, and waste segregation, like bin labels and staff compliance in line with local waste by law, and refrigerant handling, like leak detection, and qualified technicians, and emission controls, if applicable, aligned with national environmental legislation, and life cycle thinking evidence in decisions. And then for the legal compliance for all the standards, the auditors here will verify that all legal requirements are identified and compliance status is known and non-compliance are addressed. The evidence you could submit here include legal registers and compliance evaluations and permanent or permits or consents and compliance reports. The auditors here, their common finding, they will verify the resources, consents are displayed, if applicable, under national environmental legislations, and the permits are current, compliance monitoring records, notifications to relevant safety bodies, if applicable, and food safety registrations, if applicable, also under National Food Safety Act and Waste Disposal License. And then for objectives and performance for all the standards, the auditor will verify that objects are being monitored and programs are tracked and actions taken if meeting targets. Evidence here, you need to submit monitoring, objective monitoring reports and action plans and progress reviews. The common findings here, when staff are aware of objectives and data are collected and analyzed, and management review programs and corrective actions if targets are missed. And then you have in prerequisite programs specific to ISO 22000, auditor here will look to verify all the PRP are implemented and effective. And your evidence here, you need to submit PRP monitoring records for the last 3 months at least. The observations, the auditor here, in their common findings, they will observe and verify that infrastructure, for example, building conditions and maintenance records, also the cleaning, like cleaning schedule and cleaning records and cleaning agent approval and effectiveness verifications. They will also observe the pest control with bed station mapped and monitored and pest sites log and contractor reports for the last 12 months in line with food safety requirements. And also they will observe and verify personal hygiene, with hygiene rules being posted and hand wash facilities and staff compliance being observed. And also they will observe and verify the temperature controls, with continuous monitoring and alarm functional are tested and calibration are current. They will look at the water quality for potable water supply and test results to confirm are current. They will observe and verify waste management, with waste being segregated and regularly removed, and waste transfer notes and supplier. And also they will try to observe and verify supplier approval, with approved supplier lists and supplier evaluation and its specifications. And they will look for traceability, like system being tested, such as mock recall results, and also the records are complete. They will look for allergen management, if applicable, with controls being verified in line with food labeling requirements. And then for HACCP system, is specific to ISO 22000, the evidence or the auditor will look to verify that HACCP plan is implemented and monitoring are performed and records are complete and corrective actions are taken. The evidence you need to submit here, including HACCP plan and hazard analysis and validation studies and monitoring records and corrective actions. Common finding here, the auditor will look for the evidence of to review products, description and flow diagram for accuracy. They will look for hazard analysis to verify hazard analysis covers all the steps and all the hazards types. And they will check the evidence to check the CCPs being identified. And they will review the monitoring records for completeness and compliance. They will also verify corrective actions taken for deviations. They will also confirm validation evidence for control measures. And they will test traceability they will verify the traceability test. They will test the traceability. They will select a product and trace forward and backward in line with food safety authority requirements. And then for temperature control, critical for storage, the auditor will try or will verify the temperature monitoring is continuous, and alarm is functional, and excursions are managed, and calibrations are current. The evidence you need to submit to the auditors here, including temperature log with continuous data and calibration certificates and excursion reports and corrective actions. Common findings here will include observe temperature monitoring system with data and logger display, and verify alarm functionality to test or review the test records and check calibration certifications, including thermometer and data logger, and current and traceability to national standards, example New Zealand, and this is traceable to New Zealand standards. And they will review temperature data for trends and excursions. They will verify also excursion management, for example, quarantine assessment and dispositions and customer notifications. And they will observe receiving temperature checks and observe dispatch temperature verification and check vehicle temperature monitoring. And then for traceability, exclusively for ISO 22000, the auditor will verify traceability system is functional and records are complete and mock recalls are effective. And here the evidence you need to submit include traceability records, such as for receiving and storage and dispatch and mock recalls results. Auditors will select finished product. It will look for the common findings, such as select finished products, trace back water supplier with the batch and receipt and data and storage and location and duration, and select incoming products and trace forward to customers, including for storage locations and dispatch date and customer and batch. and review mock recall results with the time to identify affected products and also look for completeness, and demonstrating compliance with national recall guidelines, and verify traceability records retained per the requirements. And then for food defense, is specific for FSSC 22000, the auditor will look to verify the threat assessment is realistic and access controls are implemented and the staff are aware. And here you need to submit documents including food defense plans and threat assessment and visitors logs and key control and incident reports. The common findings: the auditor will observe access controls such as gates and doors and visitors management, and review visitors log like with the recent entries, and verify key control system and check CCTV functionality if applicable, and interview staff on the defense awareness, relevance to the local context, and verify temper evidence measures if applicable. And then for food fraud mitigations with FSSC 22000, if applicable, they will look for evidence of vulnerability assessments are completed and mitigation measures are implemented and reviewed annually. And here, you need to submit vulnerability assessment as evidence and mitigation plans and supplier verification and record test result if applicable. And here, the common findings: the auditor will review the vulnerability assessment for product handles and consider common regional food fraud risks, and verify mitigation measures such as suppliers audits and certification of analysis and testing program, and check annual reviews are completed, and verify industry intelligence monitoring if applicable. And then for the subcontracted transport specific to FSSC 22000, the auditor will look to verify transport for providers are approved and food safety requirements are specified and performance are monitored. Evidence you need to submit here including subcontractor approvals and contracts or agreements and transport temperature records and subcontractor audits. Common findings: the auditor will review the approved transport provider list and verify food safety requirements in contracts and aligning with the food safety guidelines. The auditor will check for transport temperature monitoring records and review vehicle hygiene verification records and verify subcontractors' performance monitoring and check subcontractors' audit schedule and results. And then for competence and training, all the standards, the auditors will verify the competence requirements is defined or are defined, and training are provided, and competence are verified, and awareness are adequate. The evidence you should submit here including competence metrics and training records and training attendance and competence awareness. The auditors, the common findings: they will interview the staff on quality, safety, environmental, and food safety awareness and their responsibilities and procedures they follow. They will verify the forklift license to be current with nationally approved operator certificate and check all environmental training records and is specific to local health and safety guidelines, and verify food safety training with hygiene and temperature controls and HACCP awareness in line with food safety authority requirements, and confirm HACCP team competence including training certificate, and they will check calibration technician certifications also. And for operational controls for all the standards, the auditor will verify the procedures are followed and controls are effective and records are complete. And the evidence you need to submit including operational records for receiving and storage and dispatch, and inspection records and monitoring records. For the common findings, the auditor will observe the operations for receiving, They will observe the temperature checks and inspection and rejectance inspections. They will check the rejections or acceptance, and recording also. They will observe the storage with FIFO, first in, first out, or first expiry, first out, being practiced, and stock rotations and segregations to conforming or non-conforming, and protection from damage. They will observe the picking with accuracy and hygiene and temperature control. They will observe the dispatch during pre-dispatch checks and temperature verifications, and check hygienes and documentation. They will also observe forklift operations to look for the pre-start checks and safe operations and segregation from pedestrians and adhering to national safety guidelines. They will observe cold room operations with PPE worn and exposure time limits and warm-up breaks as per national safety guidelines. They will also look for cleaning operations. They will observe the cleaning operations to verify that the schedule are followed and records are completed and effectiveness are verified. They will observe the waste management to confirm the segregations are practiced and regularly removed and consistent with local council regulations. And then for monitoring and measurement for all the standards, the auditor will verify the monitoring are performed as planned and data are analyzed and trends are identified and actions are taken. And the evidence you need to submit here, including monitoring records for all the standards, including quality or H&S, environmental and food safety, and analysis reports and trend analysis. And the common findings, the auditor will review monitoring data for completeness. They will verify data analysis are performed. They will check trend identifications. They will verify actions are taken based on data, and they will confirm monitoring equipment are calibrated for ISO 22000 specifically. And for compliance evaluation for ISO 45001 and ISO 14001, auditor will verify compliance are evaluated systematically and non-compliance are identified and addressed. And for your evidence to submit here, you need to submit compliance evaluation records for the last 12 months and non-compliance reports and corrective actions. And for the common findings, the auditor will review the compliance evaluation methodology, and they will check evaluation frequency and should be at least annual evaluation, and they will verify all the legal requirements are evaluated, including local occupational health and safety and environmental and chemical safety legislations, and they will confirm non-compliance are addressed also. For internal audits, for all the standards, the auditors will verify the audits are conducted as planned, and all the areas are covered, and auditors are competent, and findings also are addressed. Your evidence you need to submit to the auditors here, including audit reports for the last 12 months and audit schedules and auditors' qualifications and corrective actions records. And the common findings here, the auditor will review audit programs, and the audit programs should cover all the requirements annually, and they will check the audit reports for thoroughness, and they will verify auditor competence and independence, and they will confirm findings are addressed with corrective actions, and they will verify correct actions effectiveness. And then for management review for all the standards, the auditor will verify that verify that reviews are conducted and all the inputs are considered and the decisions are made and actions are taken. The evidence you need to submit to the auditor here, including management review records for the last 12 months at the minimum, and actions items and follow-up records. And here, the common findings, the auditor will review management review minutes. They will verify all required inputs are included, such as performance and audits and compliance and objectives and incidents and change and opportunities. The auditors will check the decisions are documented and verify actions are assigned and completed and confirm management review influence system improvement. And then for non-conformance and corrective actions for all the standards, the auditors will verify non-conformances are identified and root causes are determined and corrective actions are effective and systems are updated. And here you need to submit the evidence, including non-conformance reports and actions, corrective actions records, and root cause analysis and effectiveness verification. And here, the common findings, the auditor will review recent nonconformities, including quality, OH&S, environmental, and food safety. They will verify the root causes analysis are performed using methods such as 5Y of fishbone or any other methods, and they will check the corrective actions are implemented. They will verify effectiveness of verifications, and they will confirm system updates, including procedures and training, etc. And they will look for repeat issues, which indicates ineffective corrective actions. And then for the incident investigation for ISO 14001, ISO 14001, ISO 45000, and ISO 22000, the auditor will verify the incidents are investigated and root causes are identified and preventive actions are taken. And you need to submit evidence to include incident reports such as injuries and near misses and environmental incidents and food safety incidents, and investigation reports and corrective actions. Here, the auditor will look to verify that will review the incident reports for the last 12 months. They will verify the investigation thoroughness. They will check the root causes analysis. They will verify preventive actions are implemented. They will confirm the non-conformity to relevant safety bodies, if applicable, and they will check incident trends. Then, for continual improvement to all standards, the auditor will verify improvement culture evidence, and improvement are implemented and performance are also improved. And here you need to submit the evidence, including improvement initiatives, performance trends, and innovation examples. And the auditor will review the performance trends and should show the improvement. They will verify the improvement initiatives are implemented. They will interview staff on improvement suggestions, and they will observe improvement cultures and the suggestion schedules and the problem solved. Those are all the requirements. That's all the audits. That is stage 2 audits. And now you will have the closing meeting. That is stage 2 audit could have taken a day or 2 or 3 days or 4 days. But I covered everything you need, depending on your organizational size. But that's everything you need, okay? Now, for the closing meeting, in the meeting room, what the auditor will verify here, the findings will be communicated and non-conformance will be explained and corrective actions here, timeline will be agreed. The evidence, so auditors will give you non-conformance reports, and the common findings here, management will understand our findings and the comments to corrective actions. Now, if we look at stage 2, focus area for cold storage, all right? First, we will see that the temperature controls thoroughness is a focus area, like this during receiving, during storage, during dispatch, and during transport, in line with national food safety standards. Secondly, the traceability system functionality, including mock recall results and food safety authority requirements, are also focus area of stage 2. Then you have FIFO implementation with the stock rotation evidence is a focus area, and the forklift safety, including operations being observed and pre-start checks and segregation to be consistent with national safety approved code of practice is also focus area. And then you have coal exposure management with PPE and rotation and breaks as per National Food Safety Guide, National Safety Guidelines are also focus area of stage 2. And then you have cleaning effectiveness, including schedule and records and verifications. It's also a focus area. And pest control effectiveness, including monitoring and contractor reports aligned with national food safety standards, also focus area of stage 2. And you have calibration currency, all the temperature monitoring equipment traceable to national standards, also focus area. And you have food defense implementation, including access controls and visitor management, it's also focus area. And you have subcontractors management, including transport providers approved and monitoring for logistics, it's also focus area. And you have excursion management, including quarantine and assessment and dispositions and customer notifications to major retailers, is also focus area. And you have legal compliance, including permits, consent and registrations and notifications to relevant national authorities for safety, for safety, food, and environmental protection is also focus area. That is the end of this audit. It's like from part 1 to part 4. This is the end for cold storage. Next, we will have for retailers. It will be a separate audit course. But I hope here you got everything you need to pass all the standards that we covered. And I wish you all the best. And I wish you your certifications journey will be smooth and you will achieve all the goals and it will open all the doors for you. Thank you. My name is Walball. I'm the founder of QHSC360.org. God bless you and see you in the next time.